the caveats that have feature in this particular policy when we talk about climate action and air pollution. So, like Jairam Ramesh sir mentioned that we have fairly progressive policies with respect to environment, climate action, but there's a lack of enforcement and implementation. And he mentioned correctly that there's a lot of red tapeism still that exists, and something needs to be done, and new enforcement models need to be brought. What new enforcement models can be brought forth? What changes can be that we as citizens and as members of parliament can bring such changes so that there is a marginal shift that happens. When we say that implementation is happening, it's finally happening. So how can we reach to that state? That is one thing that I would really want to ponder about, and what role does our elected representatives play in this forte. Secondly, I really want to know how we can include Indian people, especially the rural population, in bringing forward the transition to greener economy. So when we talk about these important issues, we also need to realize that we are talking at a very urban level. The rural population, they still they depend, their main primary income source that comes from is depending on agriculture. Their main agenda, or the main concern is livelihood. So when we are talking about green economy, we need to understand, we need to look into those socioeconomic classes also, for whom these matters are not as relevant, but they will be the most effective by. So those are my 2 cents and my questions that I would really want to be answered.
Worth a lot more than 2 cents, I assure you. Are the other two on my list present, Tanisha and Vikram? Tanisha, are you there? And Vikram, are you there? Tanisha says yes, sir, but I don't see her on the screen. Is there some way you can, admin, can you put Tanisha in as a speaker? I think she's only in the audience. All right, while admin is doing that, let me just invite observations and comments on what you all said. As far as I'm concerned, I don't really disagree with the assumptions and the approach of all of you. One specific challenge you're slightly overlooking when you are thinking in terms of how much can be done by Indian legislators is that we don't, unfortunately, unlike many Western parliaments, we don't have a tradition of being able to initiate legislation that actually gets discussed and passed. We can introduce a private member's bill, but the number of private members' bills that actually get discussed are very, very few, and those that get passed are infinitesimal. So ultimately, our goal in influencing MPs and legislators is actually to form a sort of pressure group on the government and get the government to come in with something. Now, the government has pronounced a policy, but has done very little to pass enabling, implementable, action-oriented legislation with actionable steps and, if necessary, enforcement provisions such as fines and so on, as a couple of you have mentioned, which sadly we haven't done. So that's my principal response. Otherwise, I agree with all of you. Tanisha, you are now on. Can I invite you to speak?
Yes. Thank you, sir. Very honored. So, in the light of the recent IPCC report, it becomes imperative to notice that it is no more climate change, but it is something known as climate emergency. Climate emergency has been regarded by many countries. However, India does not figure in this list. Our neighbor Bangladesh, however, does so. So I think what's more important is the fact that India recognizes that now we're no more starting off, or it's not a play, right? So it's imperative that the government of India recognizes that climate emergency exists, and they start mobilizing towards moving from an anthropocentric system of policy to an ecocentric level of policy, wherein we focus on climate change at every level, because we do not have a lot of time.
Okay, but anthropocentric is what we're all about. We're about human beings. They're our voters. So I don't think we can entirely get away from anthropocentric approaches, that's what we're all about. But I understand that you are concerned about reacting on an emergency basis to what's happening to our ecology, and that's certainly understandable, Tanisha. Vikram, you have the floor.
Good evening, sir. I have a question, and I want to bring economics into the picture. So the question goes like, how would the transition path pan out from a national accounting framework that is ignorant of environmental costs of development to a more comprehensive and inclusive national accounting framework in terms of accounting for air pollution, water pollution, climate change, and how would that national accounting framework look like?
Well, there are a number of alternative approaches that have been proposed by various people. We haven't really gone beyond the Human Development Index approach, which is at least an improvement on the classic GDP approach. I think you're all familiar with the core problem, which is that GDP measures things that are actually harmful to the environment in a positive way. So if you chop down a tree and you make furniture out of it or whatever, you're adding to the GDP, but you're actually deforesting the place. And this is what led to the evolution both of the Human Development Index on the one hand at the UN and the Bhutan gross national happiness idea, where they said that we will not be bound by conventional GDP measures. We will instead measure how we've contributed to the well-being and happiness of our people through being able to get this kind of thing measured, cleaner air, better environment, happier life, etc. There is not an agreed standard. There are various people who have come up with various things. The government of New Zealand, if I remember right, has even got a sort of climate budget, a green budget that they pass separate from the annual financial budget. India is a long way from that kind of thinking. But if you are looking for a sort of national accounting framework for environmental damage to be administered by the government, I'm personally going to be a bit skeptical. I don't just speak as an opposition leader, but as a slightly cynical Indian. I'm skeptical that the government will ever want to give you honest figures on this or will count the things that really affect people's lives. So I think this kind of exercise that you're talking about is best conducted by the civil society sector. Let an NGO, or better still a consortium of agencies, offer their own rating. Very often that'll get the media attention, and it can be done separately. You can offer your own, you can call it your sort of green accounting framework or sustainable development accounting framework or whatever, and coming up with something like that. So that would be my response to your question, but I don't mean to monopolize the session. May I invite anyone who's available on the panelists' screen, and also in particular the other young people, the 5 legislative aides, whether any of them would like to comment on what each other has said. Does Ritika have a view on what she's heard after she spoke?
Dr.
Do any of the others have?
May I just respond?
Yes, Shazia.
Accounting?
Yes, absolutely, Shazia. You have the floor.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because the international community has various means through which they are beginning to do environmental accounting. And also the development banks have been doing environmental accounting and rating of projects on that basis for several decades now. The private sector in countries which have very strong environmental regulation, which is actually legally enforced with damages in financial terms, does that for projects as well. So in my remarks, one of the things that I mentioned is a new law that our member in the Philippines is put to the floor and is in the process of taking through the House of Representatives and into the Senate. It's called the PENCAS law, and it's going to assign a environmental accounting figure to natural resources as well. So you sort of almost need both. While we are extremely skeptical because it's very hard to move large economies and structures that are established, it also will not happen unless we put a value on what we are using, and a monetary value on what we are using. So I wanted just to add that, and then we do have still...
Agreed, but Shazia, that's on individual programs, right? We don't have in any place that I'm aware of, other than the New Zealand example I gave, a sort of national figure, do we? Are you aware of a total economy study?
Manish Mahurkar is still with us. He used to be
Yes,
vice
he is.
IFC. Manish, would you like to add to that as to whether there is something of that nature? You are muted. So
Sure. Thank you, Shadi, and thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Good to see you. Thank you for your remarks. Maybe I'll just pick up a little bit on this point as well as what we just heard from some of our parliamentary staff who made some good points here. In general, what I want to say is that there is, aside from this dimension of legislation, enforcement, and accounting for this green transition, there is an important dimension, I think, which is kind of quite important to focus on from the point of view of political economy, of accomplishing what we all want to accomplish. And which is that maybe for a number of years, the climate science behind this was evolving, technologies were evolving, and there was a fair amount of this whole question around how do we force the change, how do we force the transition. But I think we are now at an inflection point where this is as much of a huge opportunity as it is an emergency or so we can take these two paths. One is to get scared by the whole disaster looming in front of us, and the other is for countries like India to take the lead in a way, like I think Ritika was saying on behalf of Jayan Sinha, that we could think of this as a huge 10-year, 15-year opportunity to transform the economy completely and take advantage of these emerging new technologies and get ahead of them. Because there is a certain inevitability here. We will get there, maybe in a messy up and down way in different parts of the world, but get there we will. And the question is, do we benefit? Do we take advantage of that transition or not? And here I just want to bring up something that I mentioned this morning as well, that there is a large amount of capital sitting out there today in the world, which is earning 0 to negative interest rates, looking for investment opportunities. If we position our economy with some clear strategies and plans to transform different sectors, which then enable or provide good investment projects and investment opportunities, this is a way of attracting that capital in a big way. So maybe the thing is to frame this discussion also in terms of the growth and investment opportunity, because we are a capital-starved economy. We need both domestic and global capital. If that can be attracted into this space, then the whole discussion can be framed as a big transformational opportunity. And this is where you can also get different states to compete with each other for that investment by improving their own policy framework, improving the opportunities to invest. So that's where I would go. Again, in terms of the high-level number, to your earlier question, Shadi, I think what I recall, from the global sort of, or from the total emissions that we have, and this is more emissions, carbon emissions, not so much the pollutants that we are talking about here, that India accounts for something like maybe 8 to 10% of the global carbon emissions. And the reality is that whatever we do,
4%, Manish.
Is it 4%?
Too unkind. Yeah.
Okay, 4%. Okay, and thank you. And the reality there is that whatever we do, given that we are a fast-growing economy, in absolute terms, our emissions are going to increase in any case, right? And that's a challenge we have. So the quicker we can move to a lower, carbon-intensive growth, the more we can be part of the solution and also attract the big investment capital that is out there. So that's what I want. Thank you.
Thanks. That's very useful. I see Harry asking for the floor, and while he's speaking, could I invite admin to please give the mic to a participant called Sharduli Thakur. For a cricket fan, that's an amazing name. That's Shardul Thakur with an I at the end of the first name. If you can please give her the mic, she has a question. But meanwhile, Harry, you have the floor, sir.
Just to follow on from Monish's comments, it doesn't always have to be large capital. When I became mayor, I started a project to enable householders to install insulation and photovoltaic panels on their homes with a small loan funded by the local government unit, our council. and they pay it off as a normal part of their property, what we call rates, property taxes, which pay for the services they get from council. And they pay that as just an additional, if you like, a voluntary targeted rate or a targeted tax. And they pay off that loan at very low interest rates because, of course, councils have the advantage of being able to borrow at government rates. And so this funded a lot of improvements in home insulation and, in our case, photovoltaic cells, which has made an agreeable difference. Now, you could take that on a much larger scale, but it's an example of what can be done locally in a small scale and grow very quickly with not a lot of money.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. We have way over the time limit. Let me ask Sharduli Thakur to have her question that some of you might be interested in answering. And then if there are any further closing comments by any of our young participants, I'll give them the floor and we'll wrap up. I know the seniors have had a chance to speak pretty much all day. So Sharduli Thakur, you have the floor.
Hi. So I'm a 15-year-old school-going kid.
And no relation to the cricket hero, right?
No relation. So I was named, no relation at all. And I don't like my name. It's so difficult to pronounce and no one gets it right. So thank you so much for getting it right. That means a lot. Yeah. So there's this initiative. So a couple of kids from IIT Delhi. So I know about this because I also plan to give IIT. So a couple of kids from IIT Delhi had this initiative called Chakra. So they would take these small devices, put it on the exhaust pipe, and that would convert 95% of the carbon emissions to printer ink. So my question is, if it's such a beautiful startup, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we putting it in the cars in Delhi? So,
well, actually, if Gautam Ganesh, who works with me, is actually present, I'll ask him to answer this question because he actually worked at Chakra.
oh,
Gautam,
wow.
are you there? Can we have you tell us how it is? I mean, the fact about why don't we invest? That's really a question that one has to leave to investors, Sharduli. Business people have their own calculations. But I take your point. One of the things that we as legislators can encourage the government to do is to give tax incentives for green-friendly investing, which we don't do enough of. And that's, Monish is nodding, I'm very happy to see. That's the kind of thing I've been recommending during budget discussions in Parliament. But again, the sad situation in our country, frankly, is that you need to be in government to push these things into law. The rest of us make speeches and people nod, but they don't actually get implemented. But Ganesh, do you have a thought on what young Sharduli has just said? Gautam Ganesh. Gautam, I'm not hearing you. Are you on the...
He is muted.
You are muted. You're muted, Gautam Ganesh. Please unmute.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Shadvi. So I heard your question. So I was working with Chakra for the past 3 years, and so I mean, of course, the government has taken cognizance of the technology that they have been developing, and I mean, what we are noticing these days is that investment is coming into clean technologies, especially in India, and which is why I'm actually very hopeful for innovation in our country. Not just this, India, the many states and even the center for that matter are looking at policies which will, of course, help drive sales for, for this technology and, of course, for a lot of competitors that are coming through. Another thing that has happened is, and of course, Dr. Tharoor was discussing this very recently, is ESG funds. So a lot of mutual funds are now focusing on companies which are ESG compliant. Of course, it depends on what would you define a company as ESG compliant. But these ESG funds have been coming through, and now you can invest in companies which are ESG compliant. So there's of course a lot of action that has been going on in terms of investing and finance into clean tech and companies which are compliant. So of course it bodes well for the future.
Okay, thank you, Gautam Ganesh, thank you, Sharduli. We are 9:21, which is almost an hour over our scheduled closing time. Does anyone have a burning thought they must share with the meeting? I see any hands being raised.
Okay. Could I say another thing, if it's okay?
Very briefly, because you clearly are an evening person, but others will want to wrap up. Go ahead, Chardani.
Yeah. So I think we're all hypocrites over here, and we can't really do anything about that, because so let's consider a very simple example. We know that charging our phones or our